Hello, my name is Henriette Langdon, and I'm currently a professor in communicative disorders and sciences at San Jose State University. And most of my professional career, I have been passionate about bilingualism and related issues. And with the increasing number of second language speakers, not only in the United States, but now in the entire globe, I think as SLPs and audiologists, we really need to consider how to assess our clients in the most fair way. And there is no way that we can have as many bilingual SLPs and interpreters as we have languages represented in an area. So the best second way to go is to collaborate with interpreters. It sounds easier than it is, and it is my pleasure today to give you an overview of what it means to collaborate with interpreters, and I said to secure or securing positive outcomes. What I have to do is to give you my speaker disclosure. In terms of financial disclosures, I am honored to receive some financial compensation from ASHA for this presentation. And I'm also an author of the main author of Working with Interpreters and Translators, a guide for speech pathologists and audiologists that's published just very recently by Plural Publishing. And I don't have any non-financial disclosures. The dilemmas that we have in our field are things like having conferences with parents who don't speak English, or needing to assess a student or a patient, meaning an older adult, when we don't speak the adult's language. So today I am going to place you in the field, so to speak, as I talk about these different issues. Let's think that we have Anna here, and Anna is about 12 years old, and she has been diagnosed with Down syndrome, and it's her annual IEP. She has been schooled in an English-speaking environment, but at home, her parents prefer speaking Spanish to her. And actually, she has been able to express herself in Spanish, and her mom is not very fluent in English. She may understand some English, but she prefers to have a conference when there is an interpreter. I have run into many cases where parents are fairly proficient in English, but they still request the assistance of an interpreter because they want to make sure that they understand the information and also that they are able to say or ask questions. And our second client today is Bryant, and his parents speak Vietnamese at home. He was born in the US, but he's experiencing more language and learning difficulties compared to other English language learners with his same types of experiences. And he's had recurrent ear infections. And we feel that just assessing him in English is not fair, because we have found out that Vietnamese is spoken in the home. And I don't say that this has to happen at all times and in all cases, but we need to look at the other language that the student might speak, in spite of the fact that English is their more dominant language. In this brief presentation, I'm going to present why and when kinds of issues, who and what, strategies to help clients, and then what to do next. Because this is a field that has been not explored at all in our area, as I will say, in our area of speech language pathology and audiology. So why and when do we collaborate with an interpreter? And by the way, I would like from now on for us who work with interpreters to avoid using the word using an interpreter. I know that this phrase is frequently used in the literature to refer to collaboration with an interpreter, but I feel like if we say use, we're using materials. We use a tool, but we don't use a person. So I would like us to think more of the collaborating process, because as you will see, being an interpreter or a translator is quite complex. It's not just a person who may be able to bridge communication between individuals who don't use the language, the same language, but it is it requires a lot of skills. Now it's time to talk about some definitions. And this is very interesting because we hear people say translator when they mean interpreter, and maybe interpreter when they mean translator. And it's important to clarify these definitions. An interpreter is someone who can render the information orally from L1, meaning from one language to the other, and vice versa. And it can be simultaneous. Simultaneous means that the interpreter, as he or she hears the language in one language, will be immediately interpreting into the other. I find that to be an absolute gift, to be able to say what you're hearing in one language and then say it in another is fantastic. And where would you see this? In international conferences. And also you can have consecutive interpreting, which is you will hear a message in one language and that person will render the information in the other language. When we are in a meeting or a conference or an assessment, we are going to be using consecutive interpreting. The other term is translator, and translator is someone who translates information in writing from L1 to L2 and vice versa. So you can have two types of translations. You can have a side translation. For example, you are at an IEP or an IFSP, and you are asked to render the information that is written from English to Spanish or Vietnamese, whatever the client is. So then you would be doing a side translation. And a prepared translation is when the SLP says, would you please translate this fragment of the report from English to Vietnamese or from English to Spanish. So let's remember to keep that interpreter and translator differentiated. Interestingly enough, I speak 3 other languages other than English, and in Polish that I speak, which is a Slavic language, there is no differentiation in the term of translator and interpreter. And if you need to say which one it is, you have to say oral, if you will, oral translator, written translator. Why do we work with an interpreter and translator? Because we don't have a bilingual speech-language pathology and audiologist. And if you want to find out about what it means to be a bilingual speech-language pathologist or audiologist, you can go back to the ASHA definition, which is in the website. And if you don't fit into that parameter, I think it is for ethical reasons necessary for you to work with an interpreter. And IDA 204 mandates that an interpreter facilitates the communication between individuals who do not share the same language. And that doesn't mean the interpreter for the deaf. It means the interpreter for languages. And also, this applies to parent conferences and assessment of individuals whose proficiency in English is limited and or is not the preferred language. I have to preface and say that in the United States, we're privileged to have special education and to have all these laws. In other countries, this is not the case. And the reason I say this is because you will find that some parents could come for conferences are amazed at the number of rules and regulations and paperwork that we go through, and they are ecstatic that this whole process can be for free. I have had so many parents say, "Oh my goodness, this is going to cost me a lot of money to be able to have my child in special education, and then if you have an interpreter, I will have to pay for this." And they are very, very happy to find out that that's not the case. So who is your interpreter? The interpreter is not only someone who is able to render information in writing or in reading from one language to the other, but they really need to bridge the communication between parents and professionals. As I said before, they conduct IEPs and IFSPs, and they also assist in determining the hearing status and the language skills of not only children but adults. And interpreting is not a new process altogether. It has existed ever since two people who don't share the same language have come in contact. But as far as the profession as being a profession, it did not start until the treaties of Versailles, after the First World War. 1919, because there were so many countries that were involved in World War I. Prior to that, the conferences from my knowledge, were conducted in French. That's why French was so important until, let's say, the beginning of this century, because it did bridge the communication between different nations. And from then on, we saw the need to have that profession more formalized. And some of the schools that were founded in those days were the school in Geneva, in Switzerland, one of the first ones. And now in the United States, we have at least two very famous training locations. One is in Monterey in California. The other one is in Washington, D.C. And there are many other scattered universities that do provide preparation for different types of interpreting. The two first ones that I mentioned, the one in Monterey and the East Coast, are specifically for international conferences. But since then, in the United States, the area of medical and legal interpreting has been also formalized, in the sense that individuals who are interpreters for those two fields can receive very specific training and certificates. And that is not the case, unfortunately, for those of us who are in speech-language pathology and audiology. We don't have a training specific to our profession. And I have dialogued a great deal with medical interpreters who say to me that they are not very well prepared to work in our field because they don't have the knowledge of the process and they don't have the terminology at their fingertips. So ASHA, as I said before, has advocated working with a trained interpreter, with a professional, when there is no bilingual professional available. And this happened exactly. I'm so happy to be able to do this video in 2015, because it happened exactly 30 years ago. And I was honored to be at that conference at ASHA, at the headquarters, when we decided that that would be a viable way to go. And since then, we have advocated for that. But let's be truthful. Not very much has been done in our field regarding this matter. We have research, which I've mentioned below, which documents the fact that, yes, some of us, SLPs, and primarily SLPs, not so much about audiology, work with interpreters, but we're not very sure how to do it. And if we do, we have to be the ones who are training these interpreters. And sometimes the process doesn't go very well. And of course, we don't have all the tests that we need. And by the way, We don't have many tests that are appropriate for bilingual individuals, and that would be another conference that I'd be happy to give on how to do this, how to solve that. So who and what? What are the roles and responsibilities of the interpreter and the speech pathologist or audiologist? When you think about this, we are involved in many different types of situations. I like to differentiate these situations because they do demand a different context, a different discourse. You can have interviews, and that would be with a parent or a significant other to find out a little more about the client that you're going to be assessing, or the client himself, so that or herself. And that would be a little different than having conferences, because in conferences you're going to be we are going to be talking about the results of your assessments and the treatment. And in assessment, that's a whole other issue. In assessment, the SLP and audiologists will not necessarily be with the client, facing the client and doing the whole assessment themselves. They are going to be with the interpreter while the interpreter does or performs tasks where the SLP and the audiologist will have discussed beforehand what they will be doing. And that in itself is a piece of a conference. And then the treatment. The treatment is an area that I have not addressed very much, because I feel in treatment, in order for the SLP to be able to be sure that the treatment is occurring correctly, she or he has to have someone who is trained really in knowing how to do make the plans. And how can you ensure, if you don't speak Vietnamese, that your assistant is doing what you would expect if you don't speak the language? Therefore, I have not myself done very much work on treatment. But one thing I can say is that the best candidate to work with in treatment would be a speech language assistant, because the assistant already has some training in our field. And that's another thing to explore. So what are the qualifications of your interpreter? The interpreter should be very proficient in both languages. And how do you measure that? We suggest that using level 3 from the Foreign Service Institute, and it's a very clear definition. Basically, the person is able to converse in the language at a fairly proficient level, may make a few errors here and there, but they are able to convey the meaning from one language to the other. They are quite conversant in both languages. And it's important to remember that you want the proficiency to be as good in the first as the second language, because especially in the public schools, we don't have trained interpreters oftentimes that are asked to do their job, and they may know Vietnamese or they may know Tagalog very well, but their English may not be as proficient. So we have to be careful about that. And in interpreting, it's not a question of only being bilingual. It's a question of being able to convey the meaning. When you speak another language, you can't do, as you know, a word by word translation. I will use the word translation here because it's not possible. What you need to do is to convey the meaning of what is being said. You need to understand your role. Your role is not to take sides, to be for or against what is being said. Your role is to be actually a filter, a bridge of communication. And you also, this is hard, because being an interpreter, you're going to have people who have different ways of expressing themselves in both the first and second language. And if you work with individuals who have difficulties, you are going to have to adjust yourself to listening very carefully to that individual. You may not tell the SLP that the child said gato, which in Spanish is cat, when the child said cat. tato, you will say they say tato, but they really meant gato. So you really need to know the finesses of the language. So just being bilingual, again, is not the trick. You have to be trained in our profession and what we're looking for. You need to also be synthesize the communication, meaning being able to bring out the most important, the meaning without editing what has been said. You are also a culture broker. Ahead of time, as we will see in a minute, you may counsel the speech pathologist or the audiologist on how to ask certain questions from your interviewee, or maybe how to convey certain pieces of information. You also need to be objective, and you need to be familiar with professional terminology, where there are terms in our profession that you cannot translate in another language because it does not exist. Maybe auditory processing is not the term that will exist in Tagalog, and you will have to define what it means, but it's not your job. The job of defining and make it clear for you is that of the SLP. Some of the traits of an interpreter is to be flexible. And that is the trade, our trade as SLPs and audiologists. We are very flexible. What we're looking for is for our clients to succeed, to do the best they can. And our interpreter should be the same. The interpreter should be honest. They should tell you whether the job is too difficult, or they need more reading, or they need more training. Also, they need to continue improving their skills, just like as we do. Actually, I had a chance to reread the Code of Ethics for us, and it says that we should always continue to improve our knowledge, and the same thing for our interpreter. As a matter of fact, in our book, my colleague, Dr. Terry Sands, wrote a sort of a code of ethics for interpreters in our field based on interpreting in other fields. You also have to be prompt. They have to be prompt. They have to be accurate. And they have to keep the information confidential. One of the reasons why we really disagree with asking someone from a family or a minor to be interpreters is because of confidentiality. And besides, there's literature, believe it or not, that minors should not be interpreting, for their parents. And sometimes there's no way out, but it should not happen. So how do you select the person? He or she should have the linguistic and personal qualities that I've just described. You have to record the special needs types of jobs that they will be involved in. The audiologist who is going to be working with an interpreter, maybe working in a school or private settings, and sometimes the interviews may be conducted remotely. There may be situations, I have not been in those situations, but where you may need to do some Skyping, or in hospitals sometimes. This is not the case because I am addressing the public schools, or maybe a child is in a home. You would have to do it with other ways, with video, etc. For the training is very complex. You need to know the policies, the procedures, and the terms. And where you can find those interpreters are in the community, and informal resources like district offices, and you have to have ample time to prepare. And sometimes the interpreter is the one, like I said before, especially when it is the assessment, who will be conducting the assessment, but the SLP and the audiologist will be there to direct them in the correct place. This is really very important, and it's the core of this whole process, is that you cannot take someone who has not been trained and ask them to be with you. You should go through different steps, and the first one is briefing. And during interviews, sometimes you may need to have fewer people there. You should be prepared for the meeting. The interpreter, you should inform the interpreter about the family and the participants ahead of time. You should prepare for some unexpected challenges, and this is where the interpreter can serve as your cultural broker. The environment should be as comfortable and non-threatening as possible, and you need to you need to avoid talking to the interpreter directly. It's very difficult for the SLP to speak to a parent who may not understand much English, but that's the way to go. And all members should pay close attention to what's happening. So when it comes to assessment with an audiologist, it's very tricky because it's not only a question of assessing hearing sensitivity, but also conducting discrimination, WRTs and SRTs, and the lists in different languages are very rare, do not exist really other than in 2 or 3 languages. The interpreter's ability to judge responses can be very challenging, and you have to ensure that indeed you and the interpreter are on the same page. And if a client responds in a certain way, to be sure that the responses are accurately documented. And again, I'm not advertising the book, but a good resource is the book that we recently published. The SLP in assessment briefs the interpreter on the client background, the purpose of assessment, the test particulars, the suggested strategies, and the interpreter understands the purpose of tests. This is very important, but there are very, very few tests in languages other than English, and therefore there should be other ways in which you may still assess your client in another language than English without using tests. And we should follow the mandates of IDEA 204, where it clearly states that we should not just rely on tests. And a good resource for many materials in other languages are MacLeod and Verdon from 2014, but I have to warn you that the majority of those tests are for articulation, phonology, and very few for language, and let alone bilingual tests, there are very few. Ideally, then, the interpreter needs to be trained on how to elicit and analyze a language sample and select different materials and strategies to elicit the most representative sample from the client given his or her age. And that also will be very different when the interpreter works with a 3-year-old versus someone who works with an 8-year-old or a junior high student. The way in which you elicit those samples and what you're asking for will be different and will require preparation on the part of the SLP and training on the part of the interpreter. It's not easy, but it can be done. And then, no matter what, during the assessment, as I said before, the SLP and the audiologist must be present during the entire evaluation, not feel, oh, I have worked a great deal with this interpreter. He or she knows how to work very well with kids or with clients in assessment. He or she has done this many times. No, because each client is different and the responses will be different and the way in which their nonverbal communication will be different, because you want to do, it's not a question of the responses, but how are the responses gathered, and how does the client do what they do, and the reactions of the client. And the interpreter should be briefed on all the expectations before going on to any relationship with the client. In interviews and conferences, you need to review the purpose and the format of those, the introduction and reviews of the roles. And one thing that's important is that the interpreter is, like I said before, a filter. He or she may not edit the information. And the client needs to know this. The parent needs to know this. If the parent says something that is negative, Let's say that the parent had a case of abuse, which needs to be reported in our country. It has to be said so. And the interpreter needs to know that they may not edit anything that's being said. And again, confidentiality needs to be shared with that client, the legal rights. And the interpreting, as I said before, if you remember the little dots that we had before, the interpreter needs to be clear and precise. And the SLP and the audiologist is really in command of the whole thing. If anything happens, he or she will be summoned, not the interpreter. And so that he or she has the final say. So you need to keep the grammatical constructions simple and clear. That doesn't apply only to the professionals, but also the parent. Keep the sentences short to facilitate the process. Make sure the other person, the interpreter, is assimilating what you said. And it's the responsibility of both the professional SLP and interpreter to be able to do this and clarify with concrete and relevant examples. That's not the job of the interpreter. That is the job of the professional. And you have to, it's okay to interrupt the conference if there are clarifications to be made on anybody's part, on the part of the interpreter, on the part of the, but the interpreter has to be keeping everybody on the same page. And you have to see, communication is not only verbal communication, but the nonverbal cues. The parent may look worried or may not understand something. And then in bold letters, we wrote, interpreter should convey everything that's being said by all parties at all times. And the interpreter, as I said before, during the assessment should record all the responses and take notes and ask for clarifications. So you see how difficult it is to be an interpreter, especially when you do assessments. And this requires very strong oral and written language skills and goes back to my first note about being proficient in one language and the other. It's not only knowing the language, but knowing the depths of language, knowing how to use language for different contexts and be able to analyze the language, just like speech pathologists. And the interpreter the debriefing part is very important. The interpreter should stay till the end to review the impressions so that they know, both of them, what to do next. What will we do next? How can we make this better? How can we improve this? In summary, being bilingual doesn't make you a competent bilingual professional or a competent interpreter. It takes time and rigorous practice of terminology and discourse. It's a very lengthy process. It requires training and preparation from all parties. And I'm sorry to say, we don't have research that tells us what to do in our profession, other than what I have offered to you in terms of different steps to take. What we need is more training for students in their programs and for professionals on the importance of doing this job correctly. And we should not work with untrained interpreters just because they speak the language. And the research that we have shows the practice is inconsistently implemented. We need best practices in collaboration. Langdon and Science offer some ideas in the right direction to take. And I do hope that this brief video will give you courage to do a task that is not easy. And we tend to shy away from things that are hard. But I can promise you, if you do this well, you will be very proud of your work and you will serve your ELL clients in a fair and justice way. Thank you very much.